Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Beyond Never Again, our 6-week journey exploring how the Holocaust speaks to us today. Today, we are going to be doing lesson 2, which is titled "The Voice of Your Brother's Blood Cries Out." The topic today is how the Holocaust impacts us as Jews specifically. And it's not an easy topic. Some of it is academic, some of it is going to be intellectual, and some of it is very emotional. But I want to start off by thanking our sponsors for this afternoon and evening's lesson, Ms. Marilyn Kirshen, as well as Phil and Sonia Wershba, who all attend this evening, so we thank them for their sponsorship. In the previous class, we explored a lot about the theological implications of the Holocaust. But how do we go about understanding the Holocaust? How do we go about appreciating it on a deeper level, on a personal level, so that we can actually take personal lessons away from this? I'm going to open by asking a very, very controversial question about the Holocaust. I say controversial. When I say that, I don't even mean outside of the Jewish world. I mean even in the Jewish world. Often when you hear people talk about the Holocaust, they feel the need to say we lost 6 million Jews, and many others besides they'll throw in there, which I actually think is important. But there is also a movement that has happened, not even in recent years, but over time, to paint the Holocaust as if it is not necessarily a particularly Jewish tragedy. In other words, 6 million Jews died, but there were also many gypsies who died. There were soldiers who died. There were Poles. There were Russians. There were communists. There were socialists. There were blacks. There were gays. There were all sorts of people that the Nazis targeted. Yimach Shemam v'Zichram. And so, I guess to open the question for today is not just what makes the Holocaust a particularly Jewish tragedy. Is it even a particularly Jewish tragedy? And I want to open with that question. And the reason I want to open with that question is because we are going to be trying to take a very specific route today in order to reach a very specific goal, a very specific agenda. And that is to understand what it means to resist the Holocaust today. In other words, every single one of us today would like to believe that we live in everyday protest, in everyday resistance to the concept of a Holocaust. And in order to get there, we have to learn to appreciate how do we view the Holocaust, and then we can get to how do we resist the Holocaust. All right, so that's the goal of today's lesson. And that's why we're starting with this question of, is there anything about the Holocaust that makes it a uniquely Jewish tragedy? So let's start off by reading text 1. Mark, if I can ask you to read it for us, please. It's on page 40 in your textbooks.
The more we come to know about the Holocaust, how it came about, how it was carried out, etc., the greater the possibility that we will become sensitized to inhumanity and suffering whenever they occur. If we take shortcuts, we are in danger of losing all distinctions of what Professor Yosef Yerushalmi calls the debasement of our vocabulary. We may soon have simply one more word, which for a short time was a new and powerful symbol, but which quickly became emptied of all its meaning.
The word Holocaust, thank you, Mark. The word Holocaust evokes some type of collective experience. 6 million people, meaning it is in its very nature a word that encompasses a whole, that encompasses a collective. 6 million Jews, many others, all together experience something. We have a word for it. We call it the Holocaust. And I think it's important to have a word for it. But it's also important to understand that that word doesn't fully encapsulate it. What I mean by that is, if we truly want to appreciate the suffering and the pain and what exactly happened during the Holocaust, using a word, giving it a word, actually lowers our appreciation of it. Why? Because it's not as if there was one super body that was killed or one super body that experienced suffering. It was actually millions upon millions of single individuals that experienced suffering. which is why the best way to experience the Holocaust, the best way to appreciate what happened during the Holocaust is usually not to talk about what happened to 6 million people, but rather to talk about what happened to one particular individual and then appreciate that this happened on a magnitude of 6 million. It's why when you go to the Holocaust museums, they're full of highlighting. They jump back and forth. What are the exhibits? They're always jumping back and forth between highlighting one particular person's experience, even though that's obviously not the sum total. No experience is ever going to be the stereotypical. There's no such thing as a stereotypical Holocaust experience. But and then they'll alternate with lots of shoes, or showing you 6 million paper clips, or whichever museum, whichever project it is that's trying to do this. They're trying to show you that this particular story, which when you through yourself, or when you experience that story, you experience a tremendous sense of emotion. Try and appreciate that happened on a magnitude of 6 million. It might be the reason why most people, your average American's first exposure to the Holocaust is through the Diary of Anne Frank. And why many schools have chosen to use that as the format or the prism through which they view the Holocaust. Why? Because it's so human. First of all, it's a teenager, so it's great for high schools. But it's also so human. It's so singular. It's so personal. And then to understand that happened on a magnitude of 6 million really helps a person to appreciate this. I once read an article. I think I can probably find it after the class, and I'll link it in the after lesson email. Where a fellow used some version of the following line. He said, I once calculated that if I were to recite Kaddish Yatom, which means the mourner's Kaddish, for every one of the 6 million who died, I would have to daven, I would have to pray for 12 hours a day for 70 years. That's just a mathematical equation. And again, that's a way of doing that. That's a way of appreciating that. One person loses one loved one, they say Kaddish for a full year, etc. Right? And it's a whole experience. They're letting go of that person. They're saying goodbye to that person. They're learning to mourn for that person, etc. Right? And then to magnify that, when we multiply that, we appreciate exactly what's going on. And this has always been the Jewish way of viewing suffering. This has always been the Jewish way of viewing death. Jonathan, if you can read for us text 2a. You have your book with you, Jonathan? Okay, page 40.
The voice of the bloods of your brother are crying out to me from the ground.
Okay, so let me give the background for this text, and then, John, I'm going to have you continue to read text 2b. Okay? Text 2a is from Genesis. It's right after Cain kills Abel. Right, so obviously God comes and asks Cain, "Where's your brother Abel?" And he says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" We're all familiar to one degree or another with the story in Genesis. And then finally he says, "Kol demei achicha." He says, "The voice of," and you'll notice that this is not a typo. The bloods is written in plural. Okay, so immediately the Talmud, or the Mishnah, the Talmud in Yerushalmi asks a question. Go ahead, John, page 41.
So do we find in the case of Cain, who slew his brother Abel, it states, "The voice of the bloods of your brother are crying out to me from the ground." It does not read blood of your brother, but bloods of your brother, which means his blood and the blood of his descendants. Therefore, the first human being was created singly in the world to teach you that one who destroys a single human being is considered by the Torah as if he had destroyed the whole world. And one who...
Oh, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
And one who saves a single human being is considered by the Torah as if he saved a whole world.
Thank you, John. So I imagine most of you are familiar with this concept from the last meeting here, that Judaism considers one life an entire world. Saving a person is like saving a world, etc. But here is the context. The context is that when Abel is murdered by Cain, the way that the Torah views it is not as one story of one person being killed, but similar to I just lost my train of thought because I kind of mixed up the way I'm teaching the lesson, but I'm going to give you the whole thing. Hold on. But similar to, not similar to anything. The Torah views the killing of Abel as one person being killed, but the bloods of many generations being killed in one person, right? And this is why when Adam was created, he was created as a singular individual. So we appreciate every single individual as a full human being. Interestingly enough, Nazi ideology was the exact opposite to this idea. Eli Wiesel famously says that every human being is unique, right? And then he quotes the Nazis as saying the opposite. He says, remember what the Nazis used to say? What do you mean? Come on. Doctors, Jewish doctors, they're replaceable. Jewish musicians, replaceable. Jewish scientists, replaceable. Everybody they thought is replaceable. And I, Eli Wiesel finishes off, say no. A human being is never replaceable. Functions can be replaced, but human beings are unique. That is the greatness of the human being. Once you have said that, you have said everything. And we all know this about the Nazis, that one of the things they were looking to do was actually to eliminate the power of the individual. They went ahead and tattooed every single individual with a number, saying, you're not really worth anything, you're just a number. Okay? All right. Now let me explain what exactly it is that I'd like to do in this lesson. Okay? What I'd like to do in this lesson is understand what it is that we are resisting when we are resisting the Nazi ideology every single day by being alive, by being Jewish. And hopefully that will inform the way that we act. And the way we're going to do this is in a 4-step process. The first step is by appreciating that the Holocaust was not one act of killing 6 million people, but rather it was 6 million lives, 6 million individuals, each one with their own story, each one with their own life, each one with their own suffering. Once we've appreciated that, we are going to appreciate that actually universal suffering, we're going to talk about the difference between universal suffering and particular pain, and we're going to appreciate that viewing the Holocaust as a uniquely Jewish tragedy is not denying the pain or the suffering or the tragedy that occurred to others who were also part of the Holocaust. It is actually a way to enhance our appreciation of their suffering. And this will lead us to understanding what exactly it is that the Nazis had, at least ideologically, against the Jews, and understanding how it is that they came to their final solution. And this will lead us to understand what it means to resist what it was that they stood for. Right? They say, know thy enemy, right? Understand your enemy, and then you'll be able to resist him. Understanding what the Holocaust was, understanding why each of these individuals lost their lives on an individual level, will help us to understand how we can resist that, even though nobody wants to kill us. Okay? And this is the moment that I want to take to highlight that this is exactly the same thing as October 7th. October 7th, also, we need to go through this 4-step process. Number one, we need to understand that it wasn't whatever the number is now. I mean, I guess now it's also with the war, but let's say on October 7th itself, 1,400 individuals that were killed. It wasn't one statistic. It was actually 1,400 single individuals, each one with their own story, each one with their own life, their own world. We then need to understand the elements of October 7th, even though there were Thais who lost their lives, and there were Arabs who lost their lives, right? We need to understand the uniquely Jewish aspect of it in order to be able to appreciate the pain of others. And then we are going to need to understand what it is exactly that Hamas has against the Jewish people. And then we will be able to understand how we, here in Pasadena, can resist the Hamas ideology through living our lives a particular way. Okay? That's what I'd like to do with you today. So we're starting off by understanding that 6 million being killed is not one number, but rather 6 million individuals. To really understand the enormity of the Holocaust, we need to understand that it's not a statistic, it is a tragedy. It is 6 million tragedies. It is one murder that is perpetrated 6 million times, over and over and over again, each one as being a full and complete story. We spoke about how in the museums, that's what they try to do. They try to help you appreciate that each one of these is an individual story, and then you magnify it to appreciate it. This comes to us from the Torah, where the Torah teaches us that it's not the blood of your brother, rather the bloods of your brother. When Abel was killed, it was actually many generations of human beings that would have come out of him that was cut off. Okay, this is why the Talmud teaches us that the value of a single human being is equal to the entire world. All right. This has been step one in our 4-step process to appreciating how we can resist Nazi ideology, how we can resist the Holocaust in our day-to-day lives. We're now going to read a text. Text 3 is on page 42 in front of you. I'm going to ask Ron Rohr to read it for us. This is going to be from the famous Diary of Anne Frank. As we read text 3, I'd like you to try and, sorry, yeah. We're moving on basically to step 2 of what I'd like to talk about today, which is the difference between universal suffering and particular pain. To do so, we're going to be reading from the Diary of Anne Frank. And as we read it, I'd like you to consider these 3 questions as Ron reads this text. Number 1, did Anne Frank feel this was a particularly Jewish tragedy or a universal one? Number 2, would it be wrong for her to classify the Holocaust as a war against the Jews? Didn't the Nazis also target others? This is a question that many, many people struggle with, particularly Jewish people. Is this a uniquely Jewish tragedy? So Ron, if you can read for us, please, text 3. Let's see how Anne Frank viewed this.
Who has inflicted this on us? Who has set us up? Who has set us apart from all the rest? Who has put us through such suffering? It's God who has made us the way we are, but it's also God who will lift us up again. In the eyes of the world, we're doomed. But if after all this suffering, there are still Jews left, the Jewish people will be held up as an example. Who knows, maybe our religion will teach the world and all the people in it about goodness, and that's the reason, the only reason we have to suffer. We can never be just Dutch or just English, or whatever we will always be Jews as well. And we have to keep on being Jews, but then we'll want to be.
This is a very, very powerful text. Jonathan, why don't I ask you to weigh in here, if I can, or maybe Elise, I see Elise, or Jeff. Anybody want to weigh in here? What do you guys think? Did Anne Frank feel this was a particularly Jewish tragedy or universal one? Why don't I start with you, Jeff?
Individual.
She felt this was a particularly Jewish tragedy.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the ramifications in terms of teaching the world.
Okay. Do you think it's wrong of her to classify it as a uniquely Jewish tragedy?
No.
Why not? What about all the others that suffered?
Well, in thinking about it, Hitler, number one, hated the Jews and wanted to destroy them, but also he could do that in the context of war, and along with his attacking Poland and Austria, etc., he also, at the same time, concurrent with that, started murdering Jews. So it was a two-front thing. He wanted dual things. He wanted Europe under his control, but he also wanted to eliminate every Jew.
Right. So does that make it wrong of us to classify it as a Jew? Maybe we should talk about it as Hitler's desire to dominate Europe and kill the Jews. Is it wrong of Anne Frank to view this specifically as someone who wants to kill the Jews, specifically as a Jewish tragedy? Let me put it this way, Jeff. Okay, let's try this. In a 1955 Broadway version of the Diary of Anne Frank, anybody see that Broadway? Or a remake of it? Nope. Or read it? Okay. They changed the words. Okay? So they felt, I guess, that it was a little bit too Jewish, if you will. So they changed Anne Frank's words to be, we are not the only people that have had to suffer, sometimes one race and sometimes another. When you compare this text with text 3, I think one of the main things that we see is that the writers of the play felt compelled to change what Anne Frank had written about the way that she viewed what the Nazis were doing. Now, we're going to get later in this lesson to whether there's any validity to what Anne Frank is feeling, right? But I guess what I'm trying to show is that often people have this question. People want to know, people want to try and categorize the Holocaust as a larger tragedy, universal in nature, that also targeted Jews. In other words, I guess what I'm asking is, why is there a need for Broadway to make this a universal tragedy?
Well,
go ahead, Mark.
Okay, so Anne Frank wants to look at from her eyes, which are kind of innocent eyes, of goodness. She doesn't see what's happening, which is the evil. The evil is pervasive. It's dominant. I mean, we know it as older people. We know what it is. It's evil of the worst kind. And so I think that's the difference between her point of view and someone who is like a mature point of view.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that first of all, it's the difference between her point of view as a teenager and someone else's point as a mature adult, but also it's the difference between her being in the moment and us being afterwards and looking at it with the context of history, right? But here is the question I'm asking: is her perspective valid or not? Is her perspective real? Is it a reflection of reality? And I think there are a lot of people that are uncomfortable saying that the Holocaust is a uniquely Jewish tragedy. And that's what I want to push back against. That's what I want to make absolutely clear now. So let's read text 4, which is from Eli Wiesel on this topic.
Wait a minute. Wait.
Go ahead, Ron.
Are you saying that she did not think of it as a uniquely Jewish tragedy?
She did. Yeah. She did. What I'm suggesting is that there are some people today that are a little bit uncomfortable because they don't want to lessen the suffering of other people, which, by the way, is a very good value. But in the context of trying to not lessen the suffering of others, they turn the Holocaust into a universal suffering. And by the way, forget the Holocaust for a second. Isn't suffering a universal concept? Right? So therefore, they want to make it everybody suffers. Right? Everybody suffers. And in the Holocaust, many different people from many different backgrounds and many different minorities suffered. And Jews were the largest percentage, and that's fine. They'll give that, and they'll play up the Jewish stuff, etc. But they don't want the Holocaust to be a uniquely Jewish event. And the reason I'm pushing back on this, you're going to see, is because if we want to resist it as Jews, it's important for us to understand that the Holocaust was a uniquely Jewish tragedy. That doesn't mitigate the suffering of others, but it's important to understand the unique Jewish aspect of this and what the Nazi ideology stood for in order to be able to push back against it. Jeff, if I can ask you to read for us, please, on page 42, text 4. This is from Eli Wiesel, who also wants to make the point that even though there were others that suffered, it was specifically a Jewish tragedy, and he doesn't want this to be called a universal tragedy. Go ahead.
I also believe that although the event was a Jewish event, a Jewish tragedy, it had universal implications and applications. Don't give up your Jewishness in order to become universal. The only way for me to become universal is through my Jewishness. I do fight for other causes. I always have. My life is testimony to that. And I am still fighting. But I cannot allow my Jewishness to be wiped out in exchange for something I could do for others. I don't want to do that. If I were to kill the Jew in me, what would I do? I would actually do what Hitler did on a different scale. I repeat, the Jew can attain universality through his or her Jewishness, and that the aim really is to attain universality through that consciousness.
Okay, so this is a very, very important text, and I want to break it down one step at a time. The first thing that Eli Wiesel does, the first two things that Eli Wiesel does, just like Anne Frank, are number one, he labels the Holocaust a uniquely Jewish event, a uniquely Jewish tragedy, even though there were others that suffered. His second point, also similar to Anne Frank, is he says that the world can learn something from this uniquely Jewish experience with the Nazis. Very much echoing Anne Frank. Okay. But then he makes another point. And this is a point that sometimes people get uncomfortable about, and perhaps some people here are uncomfortable with. So that's why, or people watching this video are uncomfortable with, which is why I want to take a moment to emphasize it and to really break it down to understand why it's something we should not be uncomfortable with. He says, in order for you to cry out about universal suffering, about universal tragedy, it is important for you to feel this tragedy on a very personal level. So let's go back to the first point we made in today's lesson. Just like in order to experience the suffering of 6 million people, it is important for you to experience the suffering of one person, to read one memoir, get fully wrapped up in that person's story, cry your way through their suffering and their tragedy, and then remind yourself that that's only one person suffering in the scale of 6 million, etc. Just like that's important, it's also important for us as Jews, in order for us to be able to experience suffering in Darfur or in Gaza or anywhere else in the world, in order for us to be able to appreciate it, we have to be able to appreciate our own suffering first. To just shove it under the rug and to make it all part of one universal suffering is essentially to make it a statistic. Suffering exists. Let's talk about suffering. No. It's important to feel it on a very personal level as a Jewish event, and then and only then can we actually truly be empathetic to other suffering that there is in this world. That is the point that Eli Wiesel is making. To explain his point, let me back it up with a halachic concept. Okay, believe it or not, there's a section in Shulchan Aruch, not often studied, section in the Jewish Code of Law. People don't often study it. It's called the laws of tzedakah, Hilchot Matnot Aniyim, the laws of giving to those less fortunate. People do it all the time. They do tzedakah all the time, but I don't know that a lot of people study the laws of exactly how you're supposed to give tzedakah. So let me enlighten you to one of the laws. One of the things that this section of the laws of tzedakah has to deal with is the uncomfortable reality that there are a lot of people in this world that can use our help. And then you need to start making priority, or you need to decide who gets first, etc. And Jewish law has a process to this. One of the elements of Jewish law, one of the details of the laws of tzedakah are that if you have somebody in your family who is destitute, and somebody who you're completely not related to, that is also in need, you should give first to your family and then to others. In Hebrew, this is known as the law of mipsarcha al tisalim, which means you should not hide from your own flesh. You should give tzedakah first to your family, and afterwards you should give to others. Right about now, you could see a lot of people becoming uncomfortable with this, right? What do you mean? Why are you, nepotism? You're giving first to someone who's related to you. Why don't we put everybody's suffering into a basket, and then if I have only $50 that I can give to tzedakah, let me give $1 to, or a penny, or a quarter of a penny, if we're going to everybody in the world, you're going to be giving like a tenth or a millionth of a penny, and then give it to everybody equally, and that's it. Why would Jewish law say that you should first start with your family? Isn't it a little bit nepotism? Isn't it a little bit negative or bad or wrong to start with your family first? Right? Aren't you subjective to your family? The answer is to the contrary. In order for you to truly experience why a black child in Africa is starving and what type of suffering he's going through, if you have a cousin who is suffering, you will experience that on a much more personal level. And in order for you to be able to give tzedakah to others, you need to be able to give tzedakah to your own. Through that prism, in order to do that, you need to be able to, through the prism of your own suffering, you can finally experience the suffering of others. And this is the point Eli Wiesel is making, if you lose yourself in universality, right? If you just say, it's about everybody's suffering, then you're actually mitigating everyone's suffering. But if you can actually appreciate the Holocaust as a uniquely Jewish event, then you are actually appreciating it. Then you're actually feeling it. Just like when you take one person's story versus the 6 million, it's not a bad thing. It's not, oh, why are you highlighting one person's more than 6 million's? Right? Why are you highlighting one person's tragedy and not 6 million people's tragedies? You're actually using that story to appreciate everyone else's suffering. And this is why he makes this powerful, powerful statement. What does he say? He says, if you give up Judaism in order to cry out for the whole world, you're actually doing what Hitler did. That's what Hitler wanted. All of these millions of people that he killed, they're just part of a statistic. They're just part of one large tragedy. And yes, it's very sad that tragedy exists in the world, but it exists. No. To be able to appreciate it is to appreciate it on a very personal level. So, this brings us to the third element of our lesson, and I hope you now see the validity of why we're going to be engaging in this exercise. Over the next half an hour, what I'd like to take some time to do is to label and to appreciate why the Holocaust was a tragedy for many people, but it was specifically also a war against the Jews, and how it's not right, it's not correct to just throw the gypsies in with that. It's not correct to just throw the Ukrainians and the Poles and the gays and everybody else into that mix. We need to appreciate it first as a war against the Jews, so let's do that first. Okay? Let's start off with some basic Nazi ideology, if you will. The goal of the Nazi regime, the stated goal of the Nazi regime was to establish a 1,000-year Reich with a racially pure German nation across Europe and beyond. Okay. In order to do that, there were three sub-goals of why they wanted to eliminate Jews. Number one, and the reason that they had to eliminate Jews was because they were a threat to this ideology of 1,000-year Nazi Reich, right? Which is going to be pure of any. What was the threat that the Jews posed? It was threefold. Number one was politically. Hitler believed that, and it started with communism. Well, actually, it started just with Jews as a whole, Judaism as a whole, and then it started. He believed that all political ideas that he was opposed to started from Judaism, communism, Marxism, and lots of others that he was against. He believed that the Jews were public enemy number one because they were the ones behind these political movements. So he needed to eliminate the political threat that was the Jews. Number two was biologically. Hitler believed that Jews were the only race that inherited an evil intelligence that was capable of resisting and could cause the Aryan race to fail to fulfill its destiny. And every Aryan that married a Jew was polluting and corrupting the pure Aryan DNA. Okay, so that's biologically. And number three, finally, was ideologically. Hitler believed that Jews, because they had no nation of their own, they attached themselves to others like a disease, and they infiltrated whatever host nation they were in like a parasite. So he has three problems here on the table. Jews are a threat politically, biologically, ideologically, right? Which is why, as you start to go through some of the texts behind the Nazi ideology, you see that they want to destroy the Jews, not just physically, but also ideologically and politically. Let's see text 5. So text 5 is from a well-known, a well-regarded Holocaust historian. I think he's in his 90s now. He's still with us, I think. His name is Saul Friedlander. And what are we holding here? Let's do Jonathan. If I can ask you to read for us, please, on page 44, text 5, where he talks about what was different about Nazi anti-Semitism or Nazi Jew hatred versus other forms that there were throughout the generations. Go ahead.
Whereas ordinary racial anti-Semitism is one element within a wider racist worldview, in redemptive anti-Semitism, the struggle against the Jews is the dominant aspect of a worldview in which other racist themes are but secondary appendages. Redemptive anti-Semitism was born from the fear of racial degeneration and the religious belief in redemption. The main cause of degeneration was the penetration of Jews into German body politic, into German society, and into German bloodstream. Germanhood and the Aryan world were on a path to perdition if the struggle against the Jews was not joined. This was to be a struggle to the death. Redemption would come as liberation from the Jews, as their expulsion, possibly their annihilation. What drove Hitler was his anti-Jewish hatred. For Hitler, the struggle against the Jews was the immutable basis and the obsessional core of his understanding of history, politics, and political action.
The notion that I'm trying to stress here is that historians agree that the Nazi hatred of the Jews was not your standard anti-Semitism. Meaning, standard anti-Semitism is when somebody thinks that we are an other, when somebody thinks that the Jews are a good scapegoat. Like, for example, what you see now in America here, right? I'm not talking about yet, I'm not touching yet on the whole Palestinian element of it. But even like the white supremacist form of hatred that you saw pre-October 7th, right? That's very scapegoat anti-Semitism. You need somebody to blame, you blame the Jews are an easy target, right? Historians are trying to make a point here. They're trying to say that the fight against the Jews was integral to Nazi thinking. It wasn't a side point. That's what he calls redemptive anti-Semitism. Hitler, Yamach Shemov Zichro, viewed himself as a savior. He was going to redeem the world from the Jewish virus, from the Jewish disease. It's why you see quotes like Joseph Mengele, Yamach Shemov, saying, there are only two gifted nations in the world, the Germans and the Jews. Which one will dominate? It's an us versus them mentality. Not just because, they're the cause of our downfall? No, because they viewed the Jews as the ultimate evil. They painted them as the devil. And this is something that's important to understand, that the Nazis projected it this way, and the Jews of the time appreciated that this was this kind of war. It wasn't a war, a world war, which then the Jews, as always, ended up suffering a lot from. There were many other times in history like that, and Jews did not view themselves the same way that Jews during the Holocaust era viewed themselves. Let me give you an example. For those that are familiar with Khmelnytsky and Zichron, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, which was in the Ukraine in the year Tavshin Ches and Tavshin Tes, Tav Ches and Tav Tes. It's about six. I'm going to mix up the years, but over 1 million Jews died. The anti-Semitism that was raging then, though, was not let's get rid of the Jews because it's an ideological battle of it's either us or the Jews. Jews suffered then, but they viewed themselves as people hate us because we're inconvenient, we're in the way, we're whatever it is, right? That was what I would call your classic form of anti-Semitism. Redemptive anti-Semitism is that Hitler magnified the issue of the Jews to become the issue of his day. And that's what I want to talk about. Now, it's important to understand we're not putting down any other suffering that there was at the time. Gypsy suffering or the gay suffering, etc. But those were the ones that were just convenient additions to the main battle, which was the Nazi ideology versus the Jewish ideology. Take a look at what Julius Streicher. Now, Julius Streicher was not just a Nazi. He was actually one of the PR. We're going to quote another thing from him soon. He was actually one of the PR, authors or publicists, if you will, for the Nazi movement. He pits the whole thing as hinging around the Jews. All our struggles are in vain if the battle against the Jews is not fought to the finish. It's not enough to get the Jews out of Germany. No, they must be destroyed throughout the entire world so that humanity will be free of them. That's the way the Nazi Party and all of those that associated themselves with it viewed the Jews. Let's take a look at another text by Streicher on page 45, text 6. While we're reading from him, I want you to consider. Oh, by the way, these are Hitler's last words, and I want to say something to that point. Actually, there is historical evidence to the fact that at the end of the war, I had some of the stats here that I highlighted here. Give me a second. At the end of the war, during crucial moments, when Hitler needed all of his trains, for example, to evacuate his troops out of Greece, to even when they placed a citizen freeze on any citizens, on any civilians, navigating by train, the one area where trains were completely dedicated to what they wanted to their mission, even though they would have been used elsewhere to help Nazi soldiers actually survive, was with the concentration camps. The extermination of the Jews was such a crucial part of their mission that even as they were losing, that was the last thing, the one thing they wanted to keep going. And it's why this is one of Hitler's last broadcasts, as he says, from his bunker in Berlin in 1945, he says, above all, I charge the leaders of this nation to scrupulously observe the laws of race and the merciless opposition to the universal poisoner of all peoples, international Jewry. Okay. Now, we're going to read now Streicher.
But why read this? It's a satanic verse. Why even print it?
Oh, very, very good question, Mark. And I actually meant to make a disclaimer about that earlier. We are reading some Nazi ideology now. The reason we're reading it is because this class, particularly, this lesson specifically, has a very specific agenda. We want to understand the Holocaust for what it was in order to be able to resist it. Not just death. Remember, the introduction we made about not universalizing suffering is that we're trying to understand the Holocaust specifically in terms of what the Nazis wanted to do to us and why they wanted to destroy us. Why? Because if we want to live as Jews today, which is essentially resisting their ideology, then we need to understand what it is they were trying to do in order to be able to resist it properly. Okay? That is the only reason we're reading these texts, 100%, Mark. So we're going to read text 6, which is from the same Julius Streicher. And it's a story that's called The Poisonous Mushroom. But as we read this story, I want you to ask yourself the following 3 questions. Number 1, according to the story, what threat do Jews hold for German society? Number 2, why is there no distinction made between baptized Jews and others? In other words, those that renounce their Judaism. And finally, why do Jews need to be characterized specifically as the devil? Okay? Ron, can I ask you to read the story for us? It's on page 45, text 6. It's fairly long. Ron, if you can move your way through it. We're not here to really, we're certainly not here to imbibe this ideology, but I want to move through it while asking these questions so that we can learn from them. Go ahead.
A mother and her young boy are gathering mushrooms in the German forest. The boy finds some poisonous ones. The mother explains that there are good mushrooms and poisonous ones, and as they go home, says, "Look, Franz, human beings in this world are like the mushrooms in the forest. There are good mushrooms and there are good people. There are poisonous, bad mushrooms, and there are bad people. And we have to be on our guard against bad people, just as we have to be on guard against poisonous mushrooms. Do you understand? Do you understand that?" "Yes, Mother," Franz replies. "I understand that in dealing with bad people, trouble may arise, just as when one eats a poisonous mushroom. One may even die. And do you know too, who these bad men are, these poisonous mushrooms of mankind?" The mother continued. Franz slaps his chest in pride. "Of course. I know, Mother. They are the Jews. Our teacher has often told us about them." The mother praises her boy for his intelligence and goes on to explain the different kinds of poisonous Jews. The Jewish peddler, the Jewish cattle dealer, the kosher butcher, the Jewish doctor, the baptized Jew, and so on. However they disguise themselves, or however friendly they try to be, affirming 1,000 times their good intentions to us, one must not believe them. Jews they are, and Jews they remain. For our Volk, they are poisonous. They are poison. Like the poisonous mushrooms, says Franz. "Yes, my child, just as a single poisonous mushroom can kill a whole family, so a solitary Jew can destroy a whole village, a whole city, even an entire Volk." Franz has understood. "Tell me, Mother, do all non-Jews know that the Jew is as dangerous as a poisonous mushroom?" Mother shakes her head. "Unfortunately not, my child. There are millions of non-Jews who do not yet know the Jews. So we have to enlighten people and warn them against the Jews. Our young people too must be warned. Our boys and girls must learn to know the Jew. They must learn that the Jew is the most dangerous, poisonous mushroom in existence. Just as poisonous mushrooms spring up everywhere, so the Jew is found in every country in the world, just as poisonous mushrooms often lead to the most dreadful calamity. So the Jew is the cause of misery and distress, illness and death. German youth must learn to recognize the Jewish poisonous mushroom. They must learn what a danger the Jew is for the German folk and for the whole world. They must learn that the Jewish problem involves the destiny of us all. The following tales tell the truth about the Jewish poisonous mushroom. They show the many shapes the Jew assumes. They show the depravity and baseness of the Jewish race. They show the Jew for what he really is, the devil in human form.
Thank you, Ron. I know it's a difficult text to read, but I think there's one major
Very.
yeah. But I think there's one major point that I want to take out of here. Okay, and that's why we're asking these three questions specifically. I want you to try to read this text and answer these three questions while looking at the Jew as a biological threat to the Germans. This text would be a little bit extra if that's what we're talking about. For example, if the Jews are a biological threat or a political threat to the German nation, then a Jew who baptizes, right, or a Jew who takes on German ideologies should be just fine, right? There's no need to characterize him as the devil. There's a different threat that's being labeled here in this text, which is much deeper than just, oh, we need to kill the Jews because as a whole. Look at the way he singles out a singular Jew. A singular Jew can be a threat to the entire German nation, right? The entire Aryan race. That's why he feels the need to label them as the devil. That's why even if they baptize, he's talking here about something much deeper than just the Jewish body. He's talking about, if I had to label it, the Jewish soul. Meaning, he views the Jews as a force. It's not just so much a Jew as a person, as much as it is the Jew as an ideology. Let's quote Mein Kampf, which we're not really going to quote in the text, but still, same idea. In his new language, right, Hitler is talking about if a Jew chooses to assimilate among non-Jews, among the Germans. In his new language, the Jew will express his old ideas. His inner nature has not changed. The Jew can speak 1,000 languages and nevertheless remain a Jew. His traits of character have remained the same. It is always the same Jew. When you read this, it almost sounds like a rabbi who's preaching to a Jew about how you can never really convert out of Judaism. In other words, in this instance, he's basically right. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew is a Jew. To him, he views this as a threat. In other words, what I'm trying to say is, Hitler doesn't just view the Jewish body or the Jewish mind as a threat, he views the Jewish soul as a threat. If it was just the Jewish mind, let him learn to speak a new language, let him be an enlightened Jew, a Jew who rejects all his old notions and old ideas, he baptizes and becomes fully a German Nazi, etc. Why would you have an issue with him? There is something much deeper about the Jew that he's pitting. It's a battle of two completely incompatible forces. The soul of a Jew, the spiritual idea of a Jew, the notion of a Jew, even if you take it and you clothe it in other clothing, is something that Hitler is waging war against. And that's what, now, we've spoken so far up until now about the way that the Nazis viewed the Jews in the 30s, right? What I want to talk now is about the fact that the Jews themselves in the 30s understood this. There was not a single Jew who was living in 1930s Germany or in late 1930s Europe who convinced himself that I can get away from Hitler by changing some element of who I am, by maybe getting plastic surgery and making my nose a little smaller, by maybe changing my religion, or changing my clothing, or changing my language, or changing the way I think, or the way I feel. No, they all understood that it was against them, against who they were, beyond all those external, even though a lot of those things are pretty internal, beyond all of those other elements. It was about who you were at your deep core, what I would call the neshama. Take a look at text 7. We're going to see this now from a Jewish perspective, okay? What are we holding here? Let's do Shari, you're driving, right? I think so. Mark, if you can read for us, please, text 7.
The founders of Nazism and the party leaders created a scientific ideology on deeper foundations. They have a complete doctrine which analyzes the Jewish spirit inside and out. Judaism and Nazism are two world outlooks, neither of which is compatible with the other. And for this reason, they cannot live together. For 2,000 years, Judaism has left its imprint culturally and spiritually, on the nations of the world. It stood like a rock blocking the spread of German paganism. Two kings cannot use one crown. Either humanity would be Judaic or it would be idolatrous German. Up until now, it was Judaic. The new world which Nazism will fashion is directed towards primitive idolatry with all of its attitudes. It is therefore ready to fight Judaism to the finish.
Thank you, Mark. To many Jews, the Nazi ideology was seen as a response not to Jews, but as a response to Judaism. In other words, sorry, hold on one second. In other words, just like Hitler himself says, in Mein Kampf, he says, two worlds face one another, the men of God and the men of Satan. The Jew is the anti-man. He must have come from another root of the human race. And he therefore feels the need to set the Aryan and the Jew against each other. Similarly, the same thing is true about the Jewish perspective. The Jewish perspective was the same way, that it's neither can live while the other survives. It's one or the other. And this is going to bring us to the real goal of today's lesson, which is to get to the idea of spiritual resistance. In other words, to the idea that there were Jews who, even while they were in the camps, were resisting Hitler's ideology. Not so much in terms of the fact that they fought back, that happened too in the Warsaw Ghetto and in other uprisings and partisans, etc., but in terms of the fact that ideologically they were against what Hitler stood for. And this is why we've been studying what we've been studying until now, to understand that resistance will not always necessarily look like somebody with a gun shooting a Nazi. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, just a point on what then text 7. That is classic Satan versus God. You
Absolutely.
can't have God, you can't have them together. They cannot be together. They can't work together. They're apart and they fight one another, and it's a classic Satan versus God.
Absolutely. And that's why I asked on the Streicher piece, that horrible story about the poisonous mushroom. That's why the question we were asking was, why do they need to characterize us as the devil? Why do you need to make the Jew the devil in order to kill the Jew? Why can't you just say all Jews need to be killed because whatever, it'll make us a better society? No, they felt the need, the ideological view of the Nazi party was that it's one or the other. That's it. It was a spiritual idea that no matter what the Jew will do, he will always be opposite and opposing to the Nazi ideology. Now, while the Nazis were trying to show how Judaism and its ideals led to a group of people who were what they called Untermenschen, or subhuman, this then translated into all of the actions that they did. And this is where we start to see a pattern. Take a look at what the Nazis did. They consistently were attacking the body of the Jew, right? They were attacking, they were trying to kill them, they were trying to hurt them, they were trying all the different things that they did. But at the same time, they were attacking their spirit, they were attacking their soul. They kept putting the Jews into undignified and dehumanized forms in order to not only fight their body, but to also fight their soul. Jeff, if you can read for us, please, text 8a, which is from a Jewish historian about the Holocaust. Go ahead.
The Germans deliberately chose observant Jews to force them to desecrate and destroy the sacred articles of Judaism, even to set fire to synagogues. In some places, the Germans piled the Torah scrolls in the marketplace, compelling the Jews to set fire to the pile. Another German pleasure was feeding pork to pious Jews, usually in the presence of an invited audience. The most popular German game, played in countless variations, was beard. In its simplistic versions, Germans seized bearded Jews and beat them. In some places, the Jews were assembled in the town square and shorn in a ceremony of mass mockery. Elsewhere, beards were set on fire.
Thank you, Jeff. And this is probably one of the most powerful texts we're going to read today. Why? Because it shows you, meaning it's not the text that's so powerful. It's the story, it's the history that's so powerful. If all they wanted to do was kill Jews, even kill them systematically. What's this business? What's this business of dehumanizing them, of needing to publicly show that, first of all, why are they choosing observant Jews as their caricature of the Jew? By the way, this is true even of the all the anti-Semitic imagery that they put out was always, the Jew looked like a religious Jew. Why? It's just convenience, because a non-religious Jew doesn't look like so different from an Arab. No, they were exposing what to them was the main ideological difference that there was. Now, even a Jew who doesn't keep all that outwardly still has that inwardly, and they have to destroy him too. But the symbol of it was the religious elements of it. The symbol of it was the spiritual identity of the Jew, which is why they made Jews burn Torahs and burn their beards and all the different things and everything else that goes along with it. Let's see how she continues to talk about this in text 8b.
Just one comment.
Sure, Mark, go ahead.
Okay, this is evil in action.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, Jeff, text 8b.
The Germans, denying that the Jews were in a religious group, had rendered the entire public existence of the observant community illegal. Not only were observant Jews singled out for German sport and persecution, not only were most synagogues destroyed or desecrated, but all functions pertaining to the observance of Judaism were outlawed. Public and or private worship, religious study and religious teachings, shechita, like kashrut, the Sabbath was nearly impossible to observe. For the most part, the Germans, with deliberate sadism, forced the Jews to work on Saturdays and the high holy days.
Thank you. The Nazis went out of their way to dehumanize the Jew, and this caused them to focus not just against the body, but also against their souls. In other words, the war against Jews became a war against Judaism. They were attempting not just to crush the Jewish body, but the Jewish soul, the Jewish spirituality. This is when the hatred of the Jew and the hatred of Judaism starts to mingle into one, as the next text makes very, very clear. Jonathan, I think it's your turn. Text 9 on page 49.
The Holocaust was an unprecedented occurrence that combined the war in Judaism with the war in the Jews. The elements of the war against the Jewish spirit, example, abuse of rabbis, violence on Jewish holidays, desecration of synagogues and sacred objects, destruction of religious books, were not only a means of spiritual oppression, they were an end just as killing was an end. This unique aspect was rooted in anti-Semitic ideology and especially in Nazi beliefs. For the first time in history, biological race was linked with human spirit, culture, and morality. The Jewish germ was not only the blood that had intermingled with that of other nations, but the principles of morality, the spirit of liberalism and civilization that Judaism had introduced into Europe, everything that represented the antitheses of Nazism. Hitler, as the successor of the 19th century anti-Semites, preached against Judaism no less than against the Jew. Hence, the Nazis had two aims and they furthered each other. The physical extermination was also meant to bring about spiritual annihilation, and the spiritual annihilation was intended to lessen the Jews' physical strength to survive.
Thank you, Jonathan. The point that I am trying to start to crystallize is that this is going to affect very, very much the way we look at resistance. If Hitler had two aims, physical extermination and spiritual annihilation, then what does an act of resistance to Hitler's ideology look like? Well, we know what an act of resistance to physical extermination looks like. It looks like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It looks like a partisan. It looks like somebody taking a gun and shooting a Nazi, even if he's going to get shot down by the guards, at least he killed one of them, right? That's physical resistance to physical extermination. But what does spiritual resistance look like? So with the rest of the lesson, we are going to start to talk about that. We're going to start to talk about what it means to resist from a spiritual perspective, okay? And before we get to some stories about some very specific individuals, because as always, the individual experience is going to help us appreciate the whole thing, I want to read text 10. Text 10 is from Eli Wiesel, okay? And it's such an important text because there is a very big misunderstanding about Jews in the era of the Holocaust, which by the way comes with a lot of loaded judgment, like judgmentalism, which often comes not just from the outside world, but even from within the Jewish world. Raise your hand if you've heard this line before. The Jews during the Holocaust went like sheep to the slaughter. Anybody hear this phrase before? Never? Like, they didn't stand up. Why didn't they stand up for themselves? They went like sheep to the slaughter, etc., etc., etc. And this couldn't be further from the truth. Eli Wiesel points out, and this is a point actually that the Rebbe made to him. You can read the letter that the Rebbe sent to him, and then he makes this point in one of his books, his book as a Jew Today. In text 10, he makes a very, very, very powerful point. Resistance doesn't have to look, he starts off by saying, the question is not why there was so little resistance during the Holocaust. He says, if you take a look at every other group, even, by the way, millions of soldiers, prisoners of war, soldiers presumably should be much stronger than your average civilian, they went just like everybody else went, because there wasn't much of a choice. When they had guards everywhere, when they had guns everywhere, etc., when you didn't have a choice, you didn't have a choice. He says, but when you start to unpack, first of all, when you start to translate resistance differently than, resistance means winning a war, because that was impossible. The Jews just simply weren't capable of resisting that way, and they did whatever they could. He says, you start to see that there were many more stories of resistance than you realize. Let's read text 10, and then we'll talk more about this. Shara, you have your book with you? No. Okay. So, Ron, if you can read for us, please, text 10. On page 50.
To be a Jew then meant to fight both the complacency of the neutral and the hate of the killers, and to resist in any way with any means, and not only with weapons. The Jew who refused death, who refused to believe in death, who chose to marry in the ghetto, to circumcise his son, to teach him the sacred language, to bind him to the threatened and weakened lineage of Israel, that Jew was resisting. The professor or shopkeeper who disregarded facts and warnings and clung to illusion, refusing to admit that people could so succumb to degradation, he too was resisting. There was no essential difference between the Warsaw Ghetto fighters and the old men getting off the train in Treblinka, because they were Jewish. They were all doomed to hate and death. In those days, more than ever, to be Jewish signified refusal. Above all, it was a refusal to see reality and life through the enemy's eyes, a refusal to resemble him, to grant him that victory too.
The Nazis, Yimach Shema v'Zichram, were able to murder close to 3 million Russian prisoners of war and 1 million Polish prisoners of war. And remember, these were trained soldiers. You never hear anybody ask about them, how come they went like sheep to the slaughter? So then the real question becomes, what was the difference between the Jews and all these other people? And that's when you start to see resistance bubbling to the surface. Why? Because you start to see that what the Nazis were actually out against was to quash the human spirit, not just the human body. So while it's true that in a way you can view it as a victory that they won because they killed 6 million Jews, when you start to see whether they succeeded or not in terms of quelling the Jewish spirit, all you need to do is look both today, and we'll get to that soon, but even then at the Jewish spirit. Go to see. You see a wedding happening in a ghetto. That's a Jew who has every choice, freedom of choice in the world to say, I'm not going to marry somebody Jewish. I want my kids to be blonde-haired and blue-eyed. I don't want them to keep any Judaism. I'm not going to keep Shabbos. I'm not going to keep circumcision. I'm not going to keep kashrut. I'm not going to do any of these things. And yet, what do you see? You see the exact opposite. You see Jews living. And by the way, I'm not just talking about, I keep emphasizing the religious elements of it because they're the most obvious. But even if it's not religious, a Jew living his life was a resistance to Nazism. A Jew continuing to have empathy and mercy and sympathy for other people while in the death camps, that those stories, of which there are millions of stories, that is true resistance to Nazism. So it's true that maybe the Nazis had this little victory, which we'll call a physical victory. And it's not little, I shouldn't downplay it, that 6 million Jews died, but look at the Jews who survived, and even look at the Jews who died. They were completely and utterly failing at quashing the Jewish spirit. And that's the point that we're making here. That what resistance really means, it means to resist what you're trying to do to us by killing us. You're trying to make us not believe in Netzach Yisrael, in the eternity of a Jew. There's a personal version of this in Eli Wiesel's Night. Anybody read Eli Wiesel's Night? I highly recommend it. I'll link it in the after lesson summary. I mean, I actually don't recommend only reading Night. I recommend reading Night, which is his very dark memoir, Eli Wiesel's memoir of his time in the Holocaust, and then afterwards to read his writings from many years later when he repaints it. Meaning the Night is a very depressing read. And then there's writings that he has later which are much more uplifting when he starts to learn the lessons from that time. But still, in Night, which is kind of autobiographical, he tells the story of his father's death. His father was dying, and there was limited food and drink, obviously. This is in the death camp. It's a story about a character in the book that's watching his father die, but it's semi-autobiographical, meaning that this resembles the story of when Eli Wiesel's own father was dying. The father is dying, and there's limited food and drink, and the character in the book has to wrestle with himself as to whether he should continue to care for his father and whether he should continue to give food and drink to his father when it's, so to speak, a lost cause. Eli Wiesel was once asked about this, and I'll quote. He says, "The question that came up, he was dying. There was very limited food and drink. Should you try to share yours with him, or shouldn't you? Or shouldn't you, since he really couldn't take the food, your food? What was the nature of the moral resolution?" To which Wiesel responded, "Oh, the moral resolution was to stay with my father, naturally, and I stayed. It was a thought that for a moment passed through me because somebody else told me that. He said, 'Don't think of your father anyway. It's too late. You must think of yourself.' But I had learned even then, without knowing it, that those who gave me such advice were wrong. The Germans wanted us to behave that way. They wanted us to be selfish, to be self-centered, ignoring and forgetting everything about all others to survive. It was a world of ice." In other words, to Eli Wiesel, staying with his father, continuing to care for his father, that was a moment of deep spiritual resistance to the Nazis. Now, his father died, and Eli Wiesel lost most of his family. So what exactly is the resistance here? You didn't win, you actually lost. They killed everyone. The resistance is a spiritual resistance. The resistance is when you start to realize that actually just living your life is the biggest middle finger that you can give to Hitler. And by living it in a Jewish way with Jewish ideals, which is exactly what he was afraid of, that itself is a victory. The literature, I think, that we're generally exposed to when it comes to the Holocaust tells a story about people who were broken during the Holocaust. They lacked a source of light or of morality and meaning, etc. And it might be true about many people's experience, but since the Holocaust was not a collective experience, as we emphasized at the beginning of today's lesson, it's important for us to focus on individual stories that actually were stories of resistance. So let's examine some of those stories today, okay? In the texts that follow, the next few texts, we're going to appreciate the idea that there's no typical Holocaust story, and we are going to focus on stories of resistance. Not even people who necessarily survived. Certainly not stories of people who were fighting back, but stories of people whose spirit was almost crushed, but came back and managed to come out with their spirit intact. Okay? And that's why, before I have you guys read the stories, I'd like to first give a little biographical introduction. Okay? The character that we're going to talk about is Rabbi Yisrael Shapiro, or the Rebbe of Bluzhov. Okay? And we're going to learn two stories about him and spiritual resistance. But I'm first going to read to you a story, and I think it's even more powerful because it's talking about somebody that's religious, a story about when his spirit was almost broken. In other words, let's see the battle at play, and then we'll see his spiritual resistance, okay? This text you don't have in front of you, but I'm going to read it. It's from the same book that I highly recommend purchasing, which is this Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust by Yafa Eliach. And she starts off by introducing Rabbi Yisrael Shapiro. Are you ready? I want you to pay attention to the fact that he's not winning in this story, okay? And then we'll talk about when he does win. It was dark and damp in the barracks, and the woman felt an urge to venture out into the cold Bergen-Belsen night. Against the electrified fence, she saw the silhouette of an inmate. Taking great care not to startle the man, the woman quickly made her way in the direction of the fence. As she approached, she recognized him. It was none other than Rabbi Yisrael Shapiro, who was well known in the camp. What could a man be seeking at this time of night before the electrified fence? It could only be his death. A death in the shadow of night, away from the questioning eyes of other inmates. Rabbi Shapiro, merciful Jew, what are you doing there? She spoke to him in a voice in which anger and compassion were mingled. He began to cry. I am all alone in this world. My entire family is gone. I was left alone to witness the suffering and shame. I am standing here at the electrified wires, at this horrible forbidden place, so that the angels of death who dwell in the watchtowers will put an end to all my misery and pain. It is forbidden to take one's own life. They will do it for me. The woman held back her tears. In a voice that managed to suggest compassion, outrage, respect, and faith all at once, she said to the rabbi, how could you even contemplate such a drastic step? You are the scion of such a prominent family in Judaism that enriched our lives with saints, scholars, and righteous Jews. How can you stand here now and think of ending your life? A day will come, and God will bless you once more. You will be grateful that your life was spared, and besides, the world needs you. Rabbi Shapiro stepped away from the fence. Moments later, the cold, penetrating ray of the searchlight passed over the electrified fence, revealing nothing but darkness. I have some questions I want to ask you guys. I think they're very, very important questions, and they're difficult questions to ask about somebody like Rabbi Yisrael Shapiro, because he's clearly a rabbi. He's clearly, look at some of the other questions I'm not even asking you. Why would he not end his own life? He's clearly saying, Judaism doesn't let it, I'm not going to do it. They should kill me for it, right? Look at the reasons that motivate his desire. He doesn't want to die to end his own suffering. He wants to die because he has no one left in the world, and he doesn't want to view the suffering of others, right? In other words, he's coming to this from faith. He's coming to this from a religious perspective. And yet he seems to be losing the spiritual battle of continuing to live. The spiritual battle of there's going to be a future, and our ideology will win out, and we will live as Jews, which is the one thing that the Nazis cannot stand. Look at what she says to him. What does she say to him to convince him? She doesn't say, I know you're suffering now, but soon you won't be able to. No, she says, the world needs you. There's going to be a time that you will be thankful for the fact your life was spared, because your life will continue to mean something. In other words, what I'm trying to point out is, in summation, is that the struggle here is not the struggle that we typically think of when an inmate is struggling between life and death. Oh, do I have the will to live? I don't have the will to live. Wherein the will to live is basically just a selfish desire to have more pleasure and more enjoyment out of life. And the will and the losing the will to live means it's not worth it, because my life isn't pleasurable, my life isn't full of joy, and my life is full of suffering. None of these things are part of the conversation. Not the internal conversation between Rabbi Yisrael Shapiro and himself, and not the conversation between the woman who stops him from killing himself. The conversation is exactly the conversation that both the Nazis at the time and the Jews at the time viewed themselves as battling out, which is the spiritual identity of a Jew. Is that something that's worth preserving? Can we quash that, or will the Jews win out by preserving it, by resisting? And now let's tell two stories where you'll see how Rabbi Yisrael Shapiro himself, during the times in the camp, resisted, not physically. He wasn't that chief partisan. He wasn't someone who physically won over. He wasn't part of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising or anything like that. But let's see how he resisted. Jeff, if you can get us started with text 11 on page 50.
Together with Rabbi Israel Spira, the rabbi of so-and-so, in Janaska, were twin brothers. One day all the inmates were taken out to work. 3 people were left behind to sweep up the barracks, one of the twins, Rabbi Israel Spiro, and a third Jew. The German guard ordered the young boy to bring him water. In no time, the boy returned with the water. The German walked over and emptied his revolver into the child's body. Take him away, the guard now roared at the rabbi. Rabbi Spira took the boy into his arms and carried him to the pile of bodies while his tears washed the lifeless boy's face. How would he tell the other twin about his brother's death? Rabbi Spira began to ponder. How would he break the terrible news to one of the 2 souls that were so close to each other? Tell him that his twin brother is very sick, the other Jew advised the rabbi. Evening came. The inmates returned to camp. Chaim, your brother is very sick. His life is in danger. It is quite possible that he is no longer alive, said the rabbi, trying to avoid the boy's eyes. The brother began to cry. Woe unto me! What am I going to do now? The rabbi tried to comfort the boy, but he refused to be comforted. Today was his turn to watch over the bread. I left all the bread with him. Now I don't have a single piece of bread left, lamented Chaim. The rabbi was shocked, but continued his ruse, saying that the other twin had sent Chaim's share. With trembling hand, he took from under his jacket a small piece of bread, which was his ration for the day, and gave it to the boy. Chaim glanced at the stale piece of bread and said, It's missing a few grams. The piece I left with him was a much larger one. The rabbi replied, I was hungry and ate some of it. Tomorrow I will give you the rest of the bread.
This is such a powerful story, especially on the backdrop of knowing that he struggled with this very notion. Here you have Rabbi Yisrael Shapiro engaging in what I would call nothing more, nothing less than spiritual resistance. Take a look at page 51, where we ask this question. Could the rabbi's actions be characterized as resistance against the Nazis? Of course it is. Not because he helped this brother survive, he gave him bread and that helped him live. That's also true. But there's a spiritual resistance going on here, where the Nazis are trying to pit the Jews against each other. They want them to actually lose their spirit, to lose their Jewishness. And Rabbi Yisrael Shapiro is refusing to allow that to happen. He does so over and over again. By breaking the news softly, by giving up his own bread, by then taking responsibility for the fact that he ate from his bread, by giving all the different elements of it, are all essentially being Jewish. He needed, if he would have been killed the next moment, which he wasn't, he survived, but if he would have been killed the next moment, he would have already resisted the Nazis. He would have resisted the Nazis because he was living as a Jew. Let's see another such story where he makes this point directly. Ron, if you can read for us, please, text 12. We're on page 52 here. This one is titled Hanukkah in Bergen-Belsen.
Hanukkah came to Bergen-Belsen. It was a time to kindle the Hanukkah lights. A jug of oil was not to be found. No candle was in sight, and a Hanukkah belonged to the distant past. Instead, a wooden clog, the shoe of one of the inmates, became a Hanukkah. Strings pulled from a concentration camp uniform, a wick, and the black camp shoe polish, pure oil. The rabbi of Blushov, Rabbi Yisrael Spiro, lit the first light and chanted the first 2 blessings. In his pleasant voice, and the festive melody was filled with sorrow and pain. When he was about to recite the 3rd blessing, he stopped. turned his head and looked around as if he were searching for something. But immediately he turned his face back to the quivering small lights and in a strong, reassuring, comforting voice chanted the third blessing. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has kept us alive and has preserved us and enabled us to reach this season. Among the people present at the kindling of the lights was a Mr. Zemeckrotkowski, one of the leaders of the Warsaw Bund. As soon as the rabbi of Blushov had finished the ceremony of kindling the lights, Zemek Komeshkowski elbowed his way to the rabbi and said, Spira, you are a clever and honest person, but the fact that you recited the third blessing is beyond me. How could you thank God and say, Blessed art thou, God, O Lord, our God, King of the universe, who has kept us alive and has preserved us and enabled us to reach this season? How could you say it when hundreds of dead Jewish bodies are literally laying within the shadows of the Hanukkah lights? When thousands of living Jewish skeletons are walking around in camp, and millions more are being massacred. For this, you are thankful to God. For this, you praise the Lord. This you call keeping us alive. Zamikowski, you are 100% right, answered the rabbi. When I reached the third blessing, I also hesitated and asked myself, what should I do with this blessing? I turned my head in order to ask the rabbi of Zaner and other distinguished rabbis who were standing near me, if indeed I might recite the blessing. But just as I was turning my head, I noticed that behind me a throng was standing, a large crowd of living Jews, their faces expressing faith, devotion, and concentration as they were listening to the rite of the kindling of the Hanukkah lights. I said to myself, if God blessed be he, has such a nation that at times like these, when during the lighting of the Hanukkah lights, they see in front of them the heaps of bodies of their beloved fathers, brothers, and sons, and death is looking from every corner, if despite all that, they stand in throngs and with devotion listening to the Hanukkah blessing, who wrought miracles for our fathers in days of old, at this season, if indeed I was blessed to see such people with so much faith and fervor, then I am under a special obligation to recite the third blessing.
Rabbi Yisrael Shapiro came very, very far in terms of his battle against the Nazis, in terms of his spiritual resistance against their ideology. He starts off wanting not to throw himself against the gate, but to allow one of the guards to shoot him. Instead, eventually he gives of himself for others. And finally, he comes to an appreciation. He comes to an appreciation that, yes, I am obligated to bless God, to thank God for bringing me to this moment. Do you know why? Because when he turns around, what he sees is spiritual resistance. He doesn't see physical resistance. He sees hundreds of Jews that probably many of them didn't even make it out. But what he sees is Jews that even in the concentration camps, when they have every right and every excuse and everything in the book to say, God, we're not doing this anymore. We don't want to be committed to you anymore. We don't want to light the menorah anymore. And yet they're standing there and they want to listen to a blessing which says, who has wrought miracles for our forefathers in those days at this time. That, my friends, is the spiritual resistance that we're talking about. I want to conclude today's lesson by just making it absolutely clear so we all understand what this has to do with us. Many of you, I would imagine, read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. If not, I highly recommend it. I now have a list of books that I can link in the after lesson email. His entire worldview which was called logotherapy, and which flew in the face of his teacher, which was Sigmund Freud, etc., which today has become the father of this, or the beginnings of the way we view psychology today. Most psychologists today, they take what Freud has to say, but they don't view it as a dominating theory. Survival of the fittest, selfishness, that everybody's just out for their own skin. Nobody views it that way. And the beginning of that revolution started from Viktor Frankl. And I would argue that that's another one of these big spiritual resistances. It's Viktor Frankl saying, he's observing. He's not encouraging it. He's not a rabbi making it happen on the ground. He's just a psychologist watching, observing, analyzing this unbelievable concept. There's a group of people that has vowed to stamp out an ideology from another group of people, and yet those people are resisting. The ideology persists. They're selfless, they're caring, they insist on living merciful and empathetic and caring lives, which is the exact opposite of what the Nazis want. And this, my friends, is, I think, the takeaway for us. You see, in a way, every single one of us is a survivor of the Holocaust, a survivor of the Nazi oppression of our ideology, and it's up to us to resist. I want to call your attention to the video screens. We're going to watch a quick video now, and then we'll conclude the lesson.
TorahCafe.com. In 1944, the Jews of Petrikov were rounded up and taken to the train station for transport to Buchenwald. The Nazis separated the men from the women and children. Drawing on her natural instincts, a Jewish mother realized that the men would have a better chance of survival and engaged in her final act of love.
באותה שנייה שדוחפים אותנו לרכבות המסע, היא הדפה אותי בכוח ממנה וזרקה אותי אל עבר קבוצת הגברים וצעקה לאחי טולק, קח את לולק, נפתלי, קח את ישראל. אני הייתי בהלם, ואת זוכר שצעקנו, מה לצ'קו? אמא, למה את זורקת אותי? היא רק נופפה עם היד, זה היה נפנוף אחרון לפרידה, יותר לא ראינו אותה בחיים.
The young Lau was the youngest survivor of Buchenwald. Years later, as the chief rabbi of Israel, he traveled widely around the world to discuss issues of Jewish concern.
עת קוד שהביע את משאלתו לפגוש אותי, לארח אותי באולם העירייה. באתי לשם, והוא מקדם את פניי בחיבוק גדול, הוא אומר לי, You know, I'm also a survivor. גם אני ניצול שואה. לא היה לי נעים להגיד לאיש, שזה נשמע לי מוזר, מביך אפילו, כי אני למדתי שהוא ניו יורק. והוא מספר, הייתי במשלחת ראשי ערים מכל העולם לביקור בברלין, וראינו את הגלובוס המפורסם שעמד על כנו בחדר במשרד של היטלר, ורואים שהמון מספרים בטוש שחור מופיעים עליו. היטלר ציווה את הצוות שלו שיכתבו לו על כל ארץ בגלובוס מספר היהודים ב-1/9/39. אלבניה הייתה בספרה אחד, יהודי אחד, גם עליו הוא לא ויתר. ארצות הברית של אמריקה 6 מיליון. I am one of them. אני אחד מהם, Ed Koch, from Bronx, New York. I was on his target. אני הייתי על המטרה שלו. I was his destination. אני הייתי ביעד שלו. אם לא היינו, הוא אומר, the Nazi beast, את החיה הנאצית, אני לא הייתי מדבר איתך היום. אני לא הייתי חי. So I'm also a survivor. I want to thank you for the lesson you taught me. כל יהודי באשר הוא ניצול שואה.
In July 1945, after being liberated from Buchenwald, the young Yisrael Meir immigrated to Israel and was reunited with his uncle.
דוד לקח אותי לביתו ונתנו לי להבין שאני ניצלתי כדי להמשיך את השרשרת, כמו במרוץ של לפיד שמעבירים מיד ליד את הלפיד, אסור לי לכבות את האש הזאת, כך שדווקא השואה שלרבים יצרה משבר מסוים באמונה, אצלי זה היה רק מנוף שדחף אותי ונתן לי מוטיבציה חזקה להמשיך במקום שהגרמנים ניסו לנתק.
If, like Rabbi Lau, every Jew is a survivor, then like him, we too must continue to pass the torch today.
So, my friends, I'd like to conclude today's lesson in which we've made a very, very straightforward point. We have made we made 4 points that led to one climax, which is, number one, in order for us to appreciate a story about 6 million, we need to appreciate a story about individuals. In order for us to appreciate a story about universal suffering, in order for us to be able to feel the suffering of others, we need to be able to experience the Holocaust as our own personal suffering in our own lives. And we need to understand it not just as the loss of 6 million bodies, or one body multiplied by 6 million, but as the loss of one soul multiplied by 6 million. As the loss of, or the battle for, spiritual identity. And if we can understand it like that, and if we can resist it in that way, and if we can commit to that same sentence which we've said so many times in our lives, never forget and never again, then we can actually make that a reality. We can go later today, take out a pair of tefillin from our closet and put it on, and we are resisting Hitler. We can call a friend to whom maybe we had a little bit of a thing, the tussle the other day, and say, hey, I want to apologize to you. And then we are resisting Hitler. We can spread kindness, we can smile at people, we can light Shabbat candles, we can keep kosher, we can keep Shabbat, and with every single one of these acts, we are resisting the Nazi ideology. Why? Because they didn't just want to stamp out the Jewish body or Jewish human beings, they wanted to stamp out the Jewish soul. But this will conclude our second lesson today. This has been The Voice of Your Brother's Blood Cries Out to You, and I look forward to seeing you all next week for lesson 3, In Their Death They Were Not Parted. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.